Economic Suicide Race UK versus US. How the middle class is being erased. The Anglo-American dream has transformed into a financial nightmare where working hard is no longer enough to stay ahead. The UK and US are locked in a race to see which nation can hollow out its middle class first through systemic debasement and crushing debt. We expose the silent wealth transfer that is making middle class a term of the past. In 2025, a disturbing economic suicide race has emerged between the United Kingdom and the United States, targeting the very backbone of their societies, the middle class. While the mechanisms differ, the result is identical: a systematic erasure of generational wealth and the destruction of upward mobility. This is not a random economic cycle. It is a structural liquidation of the productive class to sustain failing state architectures. The UK is currently undergoing fiscal strangulation, characterized by the highest tax burden since World War II combined with stagnant productivity. The British middle class is being crushed between a stealth tax bracket creep and the highest energy costs in the G7. In the US, the erasure is driven by inflationary asset bubbles and a debt servicing crisis that has turned the American dream of homeownership into a debt trap for the elite few. Both nations are weaponizing their currencies and housing markets, ensuring that the cost of basic survival housing, energy, and education far outpaces real wage growth. The hidden truth is that both governments are using the middle class as a piggy bank to fund insolvent pension systems and astronomical national debts. As the squeeze intensifies, the distance between the working poor and the wealthy elite is becoming an unbridgeable chasm. For the individual investor, understanding this race is the only way to pivot from being a victim of the erasure to a protector of capital. To discover the tactical exits from this collapsing paradigm, make sure you subscribe to Secret Wealth Tactics. UK's fiscal strangulation. The United Kingdom has entered a period of profound economic contraction that can only be described as fiscal strangulation. For the British middle class, the social contract is being systematically rewritten by a state that is high on debt and low on growth. The financial reality of 2025 is a pincer movement: record-high tax burdens meeting decades of stagnant real wages. By maintaining a policy of aggressive stealth taxes and failing to reform a bloated, inefficient welfare state, the UK government is effectively liquidating the wealth of its productive centre to fund an insolvent architecture of public services that are increasingly unfit for purpose. The core of this strangulation is a phenomenon known as fiscal drag. This is the ultimate hidden truth of British finance. By freezing income tax thresholds, the points at which workers start paying 20%, 40%, or 45% tax at a time of high inflation, the government is dragging millions of middle earners into higher tax brackets without ever having to vote for a rate hike. Since 2021, and extended in the 2025 budget until April 2031, these frozen thresholds mean that every pay rise a worker receives to cope with the rising cost of living is partially confiscated by the state. This is not just a policy. It is a structural mechanism for the erasure of the middle class. The record tax burden and the stealth tax trap. In 2025, the UK's tax revenue as a share of national income is projected to reach its highest level since the 1942, approximately 38% of GDP. This record burden falls disproportionately on the shoulders of those who earn enough to be comfortable but not enough to employ expensive tax evasion schemes. The threshold freeze. The personal allowance of £12,570 and the higher rate threshold of £50,270 have remained static while inflation has surged. A worker earning £50,000 in 2021 was a basic rate taxpayer. Today, an equivalent real-term salary would be nearly £65,000, yet that worker is now firmly in the 40% higher rate bracket. This ensures that the state takes a larger slice of a smaller real value pie. The squeeze professional. This fiscal drag is expected to pull nearly 1 million more people into the 40% tax band by 2030, and hundreds of thousands more into paying income tax for the first time. For a middle-class family, this means the financial gains from career progression or hard work are effectively neutralized by the Treasury. Stagnant wages and the lost decade of growth. While taxes rise, the engine of the UK economy productivity has stalled. The UK is currently mired in a lost decade of real wage growth, with average earnings in 2025 only slightly higher than they were in 2008. The productivity crisis. British workers are not getting richer because the economy is not getting more efficient. High energy costs, chronic underinvestment in technology, and the friction of post-Brexit trade have capped the nation's growth potential at a dismal 1.5%. The real terms pay cut, when wage growth averaging 4 to 5% is cancelled out by inflation and increased tax take, the average middle-class household experiences zero or negative real growth in disposable income. The American dream of doing better than one's parents is dead in the UK. The current generation is the first to be measurably poorer than the one before it, funding the insolvent welfare state. The proceeds of this fiscal strangulation are not being invested in the future. They are being burned to maintain the status quo of an insolvent welfare state. The NHS and the pension system are the two black holes consuming the nation's wealth. The NHS dependency loop. Despite record funding, wait times for healthcare are at all-time highs. The middle class is being taxed to fund a service that many can no longer rely on, forcing them to pay a double tax by taking out private medical insurance just to ensure basic care. The pension time bomb. With an aging population and a shrinking worker-to-retiree ratio, the triple lock on pensions has become a fiscal suicide pact. The state is taxing the young and the productive to pay for the living standards of a retired generation that is, on average, wealthier than those funding them. This is the intergenerational wealth transfer that is hollowing out the middle class from the bottom up. The cost of living and energy chaos. Compounding the tax burden is the permanent energy premium discussed in Part 4. The UK has some of the highest electricity and gas prices in the developed world, largely due to a botched transition to intermittent renewables and a lack of domestic storage. The housing and energy squeeze. For the middle class, the two largest expenses, mortgage payments driven up by high interest rates to fight inflation, and energy bills have exploded. This leaves virtually no discretionary income, turning the professional class into the working poor who live paycheck to paycheck despite high nominal salaries. The resulting stagnation. When the middle class stops spending, the economy dies. 2/3 of UK GDP depends on consumer demand. By strangling the middle class with taxes and energy costs, the government is ensuring the very stagnation that it claims to be fighting. In conclusion, UK's fiscal strangulation is a terminal condition where the state is consuming its own productive heart to delay the collapse of its insolvent welfare models. The British middle class is being liquidated through a combination of stealth taxes, stagnant productivity, and record-high living costs. For the investor, the UK is no longer a site of capital accumulation, but a site of capital confiscation. To protect your wealth, you must recognize that the trust in the British fiscal model is broken, and the only way to escape the strangulation is to move assets out of the reach of the Treasury's ever-tightening grip. U.S. debt-fueled asset inflation. The United States has entered a structural phase of economic cannibalization where the American dream is no longer a path to prosperity, but a highly efficient debt trap. While the UK middle class suffers from fiscal strangulation through direct taxation, the American middle class is being erased through the silent, more insidious mechanism of asset inflation. Over the last 2 decades, and accelerating into 2025 to 2026, the costs of the two fundamental pillars of middle-class entry, housing and higher education, have decoupled entirely from real wage growth. This disparity is not an accident. It is the direct result of a financial system that prioritizes asset price appreciation for the elite, while forcing the productive class into a state of permanent debt servitude. The financial logic is rooted in the financialization of the American economy. When the Federal Reserve maintains a policy of massive liquidity and suppressed interest rates, that capital does not flow into the pockets of workers, it flows into assets. This creates a wealth effect for those who already own property and stocks, but it creates a barrier to entry for everyone else. For the average American family, the dream of owning a home and educating their children now requires taking on levels of leverage that turn them into debt slaves for the duration of their working lives, effectively hollowing out their ability to accumulate actual, unencumbered wealth. The housing trap. From ownership to rent-seeking. The most visible casualty of debt-fueled asset inflation is the American housing market. Historically, the median home price in the U.S. was roughly 3 times the median annual household income. By 2025, that ratio has ballooned to over 7 or 8 times in most productive urban hubs. Institutional competition. The middle class is no longer just competing with each other. They are competing with Wall Street. Private equity firms and institutional investors, armed with near infinite capital, have moved into the single-family residential market, bidding up prices, and turning potential homeowners into permanent renters. This shift from an ownership society to a rent-seeking society ensures that wealth is funneled upward to the capital class, while the middle class is drained of its primary vehicle for generational savings. The interest rate pincer. As the Federal Reserve raised rates to combat the inflation triggered by massive deficits, Part I, the cost of a 30-year fixed mortgage doubled. This created a lock-in effect where current homeowners cannot afford to move, and new buyers are priced out by monthly payments that consume 40% to 50% of their take-home pay. The American dream has been replaced by a mortgage trap where families are one job loss away from total insolvency. The education industrial complex. If housing is the trap, higher education is the prerequisite debt anchor. The cost of a university degree has inflated at nearly triple the rate of the Consumer Price Index over the last 30 years. Credential inflation. In the modern economy, a degree has become a mandatory ticket to middle-class employment, yet its real-world value is being diluted. Students are forced to borrow six-figure sums to obtain credentials that often do not yield a corresponding salary increase. This student debt bomb, now exceeding $1.7 trillion, prevents an entire generation from starting businesses, buying homes, or investing in the stock market during their most productive years. The subsidized cost spiral. Much like the housing market, government-backed student loans have served as a blank check for universities, allowing them to inflate tuition costs and administrative bureaucracies without improving the quality of education. This is a classic debt-to-asset transfer, where the young transfer their future earnings to educational institutions and the state, beginning their adult lives with a net worth of negative six figures. The silent currency debasement. The hidden truth of U.S. asset inflation is that it is a byproduct of currency debasement. When the government runs multi-trillion-dollar deficits, Part I, it must devalue the dollar to manage the debt. Asset prices as an inflation hedge. In an environment of debasement, stuff, houses, stocks, gold, goes up in price not because it is more valuable, but because the currency used to buy it is worth less. For the middle class, who rely on wages rather than assets, this is a catastrophe. Their salary is paid in a depreciating currency, while the things they need to buy, houses and education, are appreciating in nominal terms. The erasure of savings. Historically, a middle-class family could save their way to prosperity. Today, keeping money in a savings account is a guaranteed way to lose purchasing power. This forces families into the casino economy, where they must gamble their life savings in the stock market just to keep pace with inflation, further enriching the financial institutions that manage those trades. Permanent servitude. And the breaking point. The culmination of these trends is a middle class that is working harder to stay in place. This is the definition of the treadmill economy. The two-income necessity. In the 1,960 seconds, a single middle-class income could support a family, buy a home, and fund an education. In 2026, two high-earning professionals struggle to achieve the same result. This double income trap has removed the safety net of the family unit, leaving households more vulnerable to economic shocks than ever before. The social fracture. When the path to the middle class is blocked by a wall of debt, social cohesion begins to fail. The suicide race, Part II for the U.S., is a race toward internal instability. As the gap between the asset-rich and the debt-poor becomes an unbridgeable chasm, the political consensus required for a stable republic evaporates, replaced by populism and radicalism. In conclusion, U.S. debt-fueled asset inflation has turned the American dream into a mechanism for wealth extraction. By inflating the cost of housing and education while debasing the currency, the U.S. system is systematically liquidating the future of its middle class to sustain an insolvent financial and fiscal structure. For the investor, the hidden truth is that the 20th century strategy of buy a home and save your salary is now a recipe for poverty. Survival in the 2020 seconds requires an aggressive pivot into hard assets and international diversification to escape the debt gravity of a collapsing American middle class. The silent currency debasement. The most insidious and effective weapon in the economic suicide race is the silent currency debasement. While the UK middle class is strangled by visible taxes, Part I, and the US middle class is trapped by asset inflation, Part II. Both nations are united in a singular, desperate strategy: the systematic destruction of their own currency's purchasing power. This is not a failure of policy, it is the policy. Inflation, in this context, is not a mysterious economic phenomenon, but a deliberate, hidden wealth tax designed to incinerate the real value of massive sovereign debt burdens. By allowing prices to rise while keeping interest rates below the true rate of inflation, the state is effectively liquidating the savings of the middle class to bail out an insolvent government. The financial logic of debasement is rooted in the debt-to-GDP trap. When a nation like the US or the UK accumulates debt exceeding 100% of its GDP, there are only three ways out: grow out of it, default on it, or inflate it away. Given that structural productivity is stagnant, Part I, and an explicit default would trigger a global dark age, the state chooses the third path. By devaluing the pound and the dollar, the government can pay back its trillions in debt with cheaper currency that buys less. The cost of this maneuver is borne entirely by anyone holding fiat currency: pensioners, savers, and wage earners whose life's work is being slowly turned into ash. The mechanism of wealth extraction. The process of silent debasement operates through financial repression. This occurs when the government and central banks coordinate to keep interest rates artificially lower than the rate of inflation. Negative real rates. If inflation is 5% and your savings account or government bond pays 3%, you are losing 2% of your wealth every single year. This 2% is a direct transfer from the saver to the debtor, the government. Over a decade, this stealth tax can wipe out a third of the middle class's purchasing power without a single tax bill being sent. The Consumer Price Index (CPI) illusion. To manage public perception, governments use highly engineered metrics to understate true inflation. By substituting expensive items with cheaper ones, or adjusting for quality, the official CPI masks the reality that the cost of essential survival, high-quality food, energy, and healthcare is rising much faster than the reported numbers. This allows the state to continue debasing the currency while claiming inflation is under control. The death of the safe haven. The primary casualty of this debasement is the concept of risk-free savings. For the 20th century middle class, the path to security was simple: work, save, and invest in government bonds. Today, that strategy is a path to guaranteed poverty. Bonds as certificates of confiscation. Government bonds, once the gold standard of safety, have become instruments of wealth destruction. Because the yields are suppressed by central bank intervention to keep government borrowing costs low, bondholders are effectively subsidizing the state's fiscal profligacy. The hidden truth is that the more debt the state issues, the more it must debase the currency to prevent the interest payments from consuming the entire budget, as seen in the U.S. fiscal death spiral. The erosion of the pension pot. Most middle-class retirement plans, 401ks in the U.S., SIPPs in the U.K., are heavily weighted toward fiat-denominated assets. As the currency loses value, the nominal amount in these accounts may go up, but the real ability to buy a lifestyle in retirement is collapsing. This creates a future of elderly poverty where a $1 million nest egg barely covers the cost of basic utilities and food. The velocity of desperation. Currency debasement triggers a psychological shift in the populace, known as flight from fiat. When people realize their money is a melting ice cube, they stop saving and start gambling. The casino economy. This desperation drives the middle class into increasingly speculative asset bubbles, crypto, high-leverage real estate, and meme stocks. This is not investment. It is a desperate attempt to outrun the debasement of their wages. This speculative fever further destabilizes the economy, leading to the asset inflation trap discussed in Part 2. The global currency race to the bottom. The UK and the US are in a competitive race to devalue. If the UK debases faster, the pound collapses against the dollar. If the US prints more, the dollar weakens. This competitive devaluation destroys the stability of international trade and fuels the weaponization of trade, as seen in the global suicide race, as nations use tariffs to protect their domestic industries from the volatility of failing currencies. The finality of the theft. The silent currency debasement is the ultimate betrayal of the social contract. It rewards the debtor and the speculator, while punishing the thrifty and the productive. The moral hazard. By bailing out the state and the banks through money printing, the system removes all incentive for fiscal discipline. This ensures that the deficits will continue to grow, requiring ever greater levels of debasement until the currency reaches its intrinsic value zero. The structural end state. As the pound and dollar lose their status as stable stores of value, the middle class is forced into a state of permanent anxiety. The hidden truth for 2026 is that we are witnessing the end of the fiat era. The wealth transfer is complete. The state has successfully shifted its unpayable debt onto the balance sheets of every individual who trusted in the currency. In conclusion, the silent currency debasement is the incinerator at the heart of the economic suicide race. It is the tool used to bail out an insolvent system at the expense of the middle class's future. For the investor, the message is clear. Holding fiat currency is no longer safe. It is a guaranteed loss. Survival requires moving capital out of the system of digital promises and into the hard world of commodities, gold, and decentralized assets that the state cannot print into oblivion. The hollowing out of productivity. The final, terminal stage of the economic suicide race between the UK and the US is the total hollowing out of productivity. While fiscal strangulation, asset inflation, and currency debasement serve as the tools of wealth extraction, the long-term casualty is the actual engine of the economy, the ability to create value through innovation and efficient labor. In 2025 and 2026, we are witnessing a structural rot where capital no longer flows into research, development, or infrastructure, but flees into non-productive assets like existing real estate and speculative financial instruments. This shift ensures that the middle class, the historical driver of risk-taking and entrepreneurship, stops innovating simply to survive the skyrocketing costs of daily life. The hidden truth is that the Anglo-American world is becoming a rent-seeker's paradise and a producer's hell. The financial logic of this decay is rooted in the misallocation of capital. In a healthy capitalist system, profit is the reward for creating a better product or service. In the current debased system, the highest returns are found in financial engineering using cheap debt to buy back stocks or flipping residential properties. When the return on renting or speculating is higher than the return on building, the economy enters a state of terminal stagnation. Productivity, the only long-term driver of higher living standards, is sacrificed at the altar of short-term asset price maintenance. The great capital flight to non-productive assets. For an economy to grow, it must invest in the future. However, in both the UK and the US, investment in productive capacity factories, new software, and specialized machinery has been hollowed out in favor of rent-seeking activities. Real estate as a capital sink. Because of debt-fueled asset inflation Part 2, housing has become the black hole of the Anglo-American economy. Instead of investing $500,000 into a new startup or a patent, investors in the middle class are incentivized to dump that capital into a mortgage for an existing house. This does not create a new asset. It simply bids up the price of a 50-year-old pile of bricks. This capital sink starves the productive economy of the fuel it needs to innovate. Financialization over innovation. Large corporations, particularly in the US, have abandoned long-term R&D in favor of share buybacks and dividend engineering. By using low-interest debt to artificially boost their stock price, they provide a wealth effect for shareholders, while their actual competitive edge in technology and manufacturing erodes. This is the definition of hollowing out, the shiny exterior of a rising stock market masking a rotting industrial core. The death of risk-taking and the survival trap. The middle class has historically been the R&D lab of society, providing the entrepreneurs and risk-takers who build new businesses. Today, that spirit is being crushed by the survival trap, the opportunity cost of survival. When a middle-class professional in London or New York must spend 50% of their income on housing and 20% on childcare and energy, their risk appetite vanishes. They cannot afford to quit their job to start a company or invest in a new skill because they are one missed paycheck away from losing their primary asset. The state of permanent financial anxiety acts as a brake on innovation, the brain drain to the safe sectors. High-potential talent is being diverted away from productive fields like engineering, physics, and manufacturing toward rent extraction fields like corporate law and speculative finance. When the brightest minds of a generation spend their lives optimizing tax loopholes or high-frequency trading algorithms instead of solving energy or transport problems, the nation's productivity enters a terminal decline, the erosion of the work ethic and social trust. Productivity is not just about machines, it is about the social capital of a nation, the belief that hard work leads to a better life. The economic suicide race is destroying this belief. The lying flat phenomenon in the West. As the middle class realizes that real wages are stagnant, Part I, and assets are unattainable, Part II, the incentive to work hard evaporates. We see this in the rising rates of quiet quitting and economic inactivity. If the reward for productivity is simply more tax and higher rent, the rational response for the worker is to do the bare minimum. The rise of the nanny state dependency. To mask the collapse of productivity, both the UK and US governments have expanded the welfare state and public sector employment. This creates a zombie workforce, where millions are employed in administrative bureaucracies that regulate and tax the dwindling number of productive workers. This further increases the fiscal strangulation of the remaining middle class. The breaking point, a high-cost, low-output society. The culmination of the hollowing out is a society that is both expensive and inefficient. This is the ultimate hidden truth. The Anglo-American world is losing its authority because it can no longer produce its way out of its problems. The inevitability of stagnation. A nation that does not invest in its own productivity cannot grow. It can only reallocate the shrinking pie through inflation and taxation. This ensures that the UK and the US will continue to lose market share to nations that still value industrial output and engineering, the very rivals analyzed in the global suicide race. The strategic vulnerability. By hollowing out its manufacturing and engineering base, the West has become strategically vulnerable. It relies on rivals for everything from basic medicines to advanced semiconductors. This dependency ensures that any geopolitical friction, Part 3, results in immediate, painful inflation for the domestic middle class, further accelerating the erasure. In conclusion, the hollowing out of productivity is the final nail in the coffin of middle-class prosperity. By incentivizing rent-seeking over building and survival over risk-taking, the UK and the US have successfully dismantled their own economic engines. For the investor, the message is final. The old growth models are broken. Survival in 2026 requires identifying the islands of productivity that still exist, decentralized technologies, specialized high-tech manufacturing outside the Anglo-American core, and hard assets that do not rely on a hollowed-out fiat system. The race is nearly over. The middle class has been erased, and only those who recognize the hidden truth of this structural rot will be able to protect their capital in the new low-productivity reality. This concludes our series on the UK versus US economic suicide race. Would you like me to synthesize these findings into a survival guide for the post-middle class era? Focusing on how to reallocate your portfolio to avoid the fiscal and inflationary traps of the next decade? The race to erase the middle class is accelerating, and the traditional safe paths of the 20th century are now dead ends. Whether it's the UK's tax trap or the US inflation bomb, your primary residence and your 9-to-5 salary are no longer enough to guarantee your future. The system is being redesigned to keep you on a treadmill of diminishing returns. Subscribe to Secret Wealth Tactics now and activate notifications. We provide the institutional-grade analysis and hidden truth strategies you need to exit the fiat trap and move your wealth into hard assets that the state cannot erase. Stay ahead of the collapse. Join the community today.